Hey loves, my name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing Fear Traps, Escape the Triggers That Keep You Stuck by Dr. Nancy Stella. As a brief disclaimer, I did want to note that while this video is not monetarily sponsored in any way, I did receive my copy in order to review and feature on my social channels from Books Forward. Fear Traps, or as I like to call it, alternate saw title number 1, is written by Dr. Nancy Stella, an actual psychologist, and it features what Stella refers to as the courageous brain process, a method of actually changing the neural pathways in your brain in order to better manage and avoid triggers so they don't elicit such drastic fear responses. Now, as a brief trigger warning, I did want to note that while the entire book very much discusses the topic of triggers and managing them, there are some discussion topics that may be particularly triggering to some readers, including depictions of abuse, so please have discretion while advised. But reading is also recommended. The courageous brain process that is very heavily featured within the book is achieved through 6 steps. Step 1, tell your story. Step 2, identify your triggers. Step 3, describe patterns of self-sabotage. Step 4, imagine the worst case scenario. Step 5, create a courageous brain. And step 6, live free of the fear trap. This is demonstrated through 6 different chapters, giving examples of 6 different incredibly common fears that can be triggered by different events in one's lives. And it features 6 different examples of Dr. Stella herself, as well as 5 other patients that she has. And the process tells the patient's story, and then the process of creating a courageous brain for themselves through the 6 steps of the courageous brain process. So you get to see 6 different examples of different people implementing this into their lives. So the chapters are formatted where they give, background information on the particular scenario that's being discussed, as well as scientific evidence that relates to the particular problem at hand. And then it goes through what the particular patients did for each of their 6 steps of creating a courageous brain. And each of the chapters feature a personal meditation prompt in order to help reinforce the courageous brain for yourself that you are able to follow along with if any of these particular fears apply to you. The fears that are specifically exemplified within the book include the fear of being alone, the fear of rejection, the fear of confrontation, the fear of being ignored, the fear of failure, and the fear of the unknown. So while reading this book, it honestly felt like I was getting a free therapy session. There was definitely a lot of very useful information within the book that was presented very gently in a way that didn't feel patronizing at all. It genuinely just felt like it was trying to be helpful and supportive of the reader and the patients that are involved within the examples of the book. And while it definitely did feel a little bit cheesy at times, I do definitely think that that kind of just comes with the nature of therapeutic instances. To me, at least, some of it does just feel very like stereotypy therapist, but that's also kind of the point, is like, they're stereotypes for a reason, because therapists definitely have certain ways of doing things and helping their clients think in certain ways to help them come about and solve their problems. So it definitely makes sense. And I definitely think that the book could be very, very useful to a lot of people, particularly people who do share the fears that are featured within the book, or just do experience things that are more minor triggers. And I do say that because even the book itself does acknowledge the fact that like some instances of trauma are definitely a little bit heavier than others and do require more direct professional help than just like reading the book for yourself. So there are several different points within the book where it does kind of have side notes where it's like, hey, if you've experienced blah, 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 like perhaps consider doing the courageous brain process with an actual professional, which I do think was a really, really good thing to acknowledge, that like, yes, this is absolutely very, very helpful and has the potential to be fantastic for a lot of people, that there are definitely a certain demographic that aren't going to be the most receptive to this because some of their triggers are a lot more deeply ingrained in their psyche and do require a lot more personal care and attention to be able to improve in their lives. But on the flip side of that, if you do experience different triggers from different traumas that aren't necessarily as damaging as others, even if you don't experience any of the particular fears that this book represents, the information is definitely presented neutrally enough that you could really apply the so-called courageous brain process to any trigger that you happen to have within your life. And I think that that's really important, especially like considering myself. I didn't necessarily relate to most of the fears that were featured within the book, so I definitely went into it thinking like this may not be the book for me. And I was very pleasantly surprised that it just had a lot of information that was presented neutrally enough to be able to be applicable to any experience. I also thought that reading it was a really good way to get a little bit of a revelation into some other people's thought processes. And it could definitely be a good way to gain empathy for other people because it broke down different thoughts and feelings that people had, but why exactly they had those thoughts and feelings, and broke down a lot of the more core elements to that. And I thought it was just a really eye-opening way to have information presented, where it's definitely going to leave me a little bit more open and understanding to trying to figure out why exactly certain people have certain reactions that they do and why they think the ways that they do, and how that could possibly be attributed to things that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with past experiences of theirs. So if nothing else, I do definitely think that readers can get a lot of empathy out of this book. There's definitely a bit of actual psychological and neurological information within the book, and considering that the author does have a doctorate and is a licensed psychologist, does definitely leave me a little bit more comfortable reading this type of information than I would reading it from somebody who did not have those credentials behind their name. Because it is a lot of very, very heavy stuff, especially when you're talking about instances of mental health and psychology. I definitely think that you need to have a little bit of authority when discussing those kind of topics from an educational standpoint. And I think this is a really good example of that. Whereas like if this came from somebody who was not a licensed psychologist, I don't think I would necessarily buy into it as much as I did. But I also don't think that this would have been able to have been written by anybody who wasn't a psychologist themselves. So I definitely think that that's also a really good way to comfort readers as well, having them know that this does come from a place of authority and education, that you are able to genuinely ingest what you're reading and know that it is factual to the point of where we are at in our neurological knowledge at this point in time culture-wise. Because too, the book also definitely goes into some previously held notions that the community of therapists and psychologists held about how the brain worked in certain ways, more specifically how it used to be common practice for therapists to have patients relive past trauma and explain it over and over again with the intention of them gaining insight from it, but then not having the proper tools to be able to build on that and apply it to their life currently. So instead of being beneficial to them in any way, it was actually just driving the triggering neural pathways in their brain even deeper than they would be had different practices been in place. So the book definitely acknowledges that and shows that this is a new way of thinking that is able to create new neural pathways, avoiding triggering ones, versus just continuing to deepen and further ingrain triggering neural pathways that have been a result of trauma. So honestly, I would definitely very much recommend the book, especially for anybody who does happen to experience any triggers of any kind in their own life, which I do definitely believe that for the most part, most people do have triggers to some extent or another, whether it is very, very deeply held to the point where it causes actual panic reactions and things that are even more negative versus just, you know, ones that do cause some minor inconvenient and negative feelings. I definitely think that just about anybody can get benefit from this particular book. The only criticisms of the book that I would say that I had were, one, that the book does very much focus on the concept of trauma from childhood being created and doesn't necessarily acknowledge that trauma can be created at any age. Like, it does briefly, and then the entire rest of the book is definitely reinforcing the childhood trauma concept, where trauma can occur at any age in any person's life, and it's not always an instance of like when you're triggered, you're going back to your childhood mind state. So I would have liked to have seen a little bit more emphasis on the concept that trauma can be created at any point in time and not just in childhood and not just stemming from parental relations. But I definitely think that people can compartmentalize and still be able to apply what they've learned from the book into scenarios where trauma was created later in life, especially into adulthood. But other than that, I do think that the book is a very, very beneficial one and is definitely a good read to have under your belt. Especially considering it is so short and it is so easy to read. Like, it's definitely not the kind of book where it necessarily like amplifies its vocabulary to a point where it's alienating to a lot of people. Like, yeah, there's definitely some therapy type terms that are used that may be newer to some people who aren't as experienced with the topic as others, but I think it's definitely written in a way that's neutral enough to where just about anybody is going to be able to understand the text and topics, which is fantastic for that accessibility. And it's a very, very short read. Like, literally, I finished it probably within about 2 hours. Like, it's definitely a single day read for just about anybody. So if you have any interest in checking it out, I would very highly recommend it for yourself. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace.